going to be looking at putting together some Eldritch horrors. Now, if you've seen my previous videos, you'll know I've been experimenting with melting monster clay, and the first video looked at putting together this chap, which if you've seen the video, you'll know that that was inspired by a picture of a turkey that I saw online, of all things. Now, since then, I've expanded my technique a little bit. I was looking at various ways of melting monster clay to create textures in the sculpture. So I've sort of rolled with that and have come up with a few, not exactly new techniques, but just expansions on what I was doing previously. And that's led me to do 3 new ones here. So these are actually going to be figurines which I want to mould and cast, but in this video I'm going to look at just sculpting these up, and I'll look at moulding them in a future video. So in this video we're going to be looking at putting together primarily this chap, although we'll have a look at some of the other guys as well. So let's get started. So this all started off with this guy. For those of you who haven't seen it, there's a previous video on my channel going over this sculpture. But essentially it was inspired by a picture of a turkey which I found online, which you can see here. And as you can see, it looks pretty demonic. So I thought, well, I wanted to try and make a sculpture of this because it was quite an interesting image. But obviously there's a lot of wrinkled skin in the image and a lot of sort of organic shapes. And I needed to think about how I would actually do those in clay. I mean, obviously you can try and sculpt them manually, but getting that sort of organic flow, it can be quite difficult to make it look natural and not artificial. So I wanted to come up with a way of creating those shapes, and what I came up with was to pour molten monster clay into water, and that gave me some really nice organic shapes to work with. Now, I mentioned in the previous video that this sculpture that I've created is too big if I wanted to make a mould of it. Of course I could make a mould of it, but I'd have to use probably at least 1 kilo of resin in order to actually cast that up. And the bigger you make things, the more expensive they get. Obviously if you want to sell them, then there's weight issues when you're actually trying to post stuff as well. So it seemed to me that if I did want to actually try and make some casts of this and potentially sell them, it should be smaller. So I decided to try and make a smaller version. I mentioned I was thinking about it in the video, but I decided to have a go with that. And this is what I came up with. As you can see, it's much smaller than the previous version. It's also got an arm. My fiancé suggested he could be holding his entrails in his hand, so that sort of seemed like quite a cool idea to me. So that's what he's doing. And what I've used is lots of pieces of molten monster clay that I've poured into water to get these really cool organic shapes. And as you can see, I've also given him a sort of a base made out of these shapes as well. So I was quite pleased with how that came out, but then I got a little bit carried away and started making some additional sculptures. So I started making this guy as well, and they're all sort of, I suppose, Cthulhu orientated. You know, they're all sort of gribbly creatures with tentacles and so forth, so a little bit Cthulhu-esque. One thing I found when I was halfway through doing the sculpture, that I actually thought I needed something more on the shoulders, because he's got quite a big head, but his body is sort of regular sized. I thought maybe it needed a little bit more, just to sort of give it a bit more balance perhaps. So I thought I could do some shoulder pads on him, and I thought I should probably do them as separate items. If I'm going to make a mould of this, I was sort of thinking about how easily that would come out, so I decided to do these as separate pieces. Now it can be quite tricky to do things that are going to go onto a sculpture, because you need a firm base to sculpt against, and obviously I needed these to fit the sculpture that I'd already made. So what I decided to do was to cover the shoulders in some foil just to create a bit of a barrier, and then I just sculpted over them lightly with epoxy. Once that was set, it gave me a hard base to sculpt against. So what I did was to come in with some hard monster clay, and the reason I did that is because I'm going to be handling these. I didn't want to sort of destroy the detail that I was putting in simply by handling them all the time. So I thought if I use hard monster clay, that's going to be a little bit more robust when I handle it. So that should make it a bit easier to deal with. What I also used was this, which is a wax melter. I think I've mentioned this on the channel before, but it's typically used for melting sort of aromatic waxes, and it will make your room smell nice. But I thought, well, this has got to work for monster clay as well, and it works well enough. I don't use it that often, but if you want some molten monster clay that you can just sort of brush onto a shape, then this is really, really useful. So what I'm doing here is, this is molten hard monster clay, and I'm just brushing this over the epoxy shape. That way it's going to stick to it a little bit better than if I pressed it on with my fingers. So this is what I came up with, and as you can see, it's got this sort of organic detail to it and a sort of flowing, almost bony kind of structure around it. Now, I mentioned in the previous video that what I was using was a pyrography pen, which was a heated tool basically to melt the monster clay and get some really cool kind of melted organic looking detail. So for this one, what I actually did was to get a digital soldering station. Now this actually came, the company in the building above where I work went bust, and there was a load of stuff left over, and the facilities people at work said, well, does anyone want any of this stuff before we bin it? So we all went up to see what there was, and this was amongst all of the pieces there. So it's never been used, brand new. So I thought, well, that's going to be really useful, because what it can do that the pyrography pen can't do is that you can control the temperature. The pyrography pen, I think, was probably at about sort of 200 or 300 degrees, so it was really melting and burning the clay as I was using it. So I think it was a little bit too hot. So with this, if I set it to the lowest setting, which is 150 degrees centigrade, this will melt the monster clay, but it won't burn it. So that's actually proved really, really useful for doing this detail. So I want to talk about using this a little bit more when I come to do the main sculpture, but for this one, that's how I did a lot of the organic detail. So once I'd had a bit of an experiment with the soldering station, I was sort of ready to have a proper go, and I was sort of building up from this. The first two sculptures I'd done I thought were a little bit static, so I wanted to do something with a little bit more motion to it. And what I'm doing is using a piece of copper pipe, and I've got these bases which I made ages ago, which I use for all my sculptures pretty much. So they're really easy to use and handy, and what I've done is just to attach a bit of wire to the top of that, and that's going to give me an armature to sculpt against. So it's going to be a bust, so torso and head only. But what I want to do is have quite a prominent rib cage in this one. So I'm sort of sculpting the basic shape of this. What you can see me using here is actually, I think it's a cuticle tool, so like a tool for doing manicures on your nails. I bought a set of these for like a couple of pounds, but they're really, really useful for sculpting. So it's worth looking on Amazon for, you know, nail products, things like that, because often they can be used for sculpture as well. So what I found the soldering iron quite useful for is just sort of cutting lines into sculptures to give a bit of texture, because unlike a sculpting tool, it gives quite a nice rounded smooth finish rather than sort of raking up little blobs of clay as it goes. So what I'm doing is cutting in some channels initially just to give the shape of some ribs. I can then come in and start melting in some detail with the soldering iron. So what I found is that you can just melt in some detail initially. It doesn't have to look too neat as long as you get the basic pattern. What you can then do is let that cool down, then come in again and just start shaping it. And because it's got a element of randomness to it, it gives quite a nice organic finish to the shapes that you're creating. Now, because I've got this rib cage, which is basically empty, I want to fill it. And obviously a lot of these pieces of monster clay that I've got by pouring into water look really organic, they look a bit like internal organs. So I thought it would be really cool if I sort of dressed the interior with some of these to make it look like there's a sort of I don't know, a column of internal organs coming up and joining in the rib cage. So I'm just trying to fill in that cavity and put something together that looks quite organic. Now, because these are just a big bunch of disparate shapes, I'm having to be quite careful about how I put them together. But what I've found is that the soldering iron is really good for joining these together. Because it melts the clay, you can get some quite nice organic finishes to things. So that allows you to sort of blend these items together quite easily. So I had a bit of an experiment with the face. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it. I had a vague idea that I wanted him to be wearing a skull mask, so the idea that he's got the skull from somewhere and he's wearing it, and so I'm trying to come up with a look that looks a bit like a skull but that looks, you know, kind of alien. A motif I've kind of put in for a few of these is that they've all got 3 eyes on each side of their head, so I've done the skull in the same way, and the idea is that he can be using that as a mask. Now for the bone texture, I'm using this texture stamp that I made a while back. I made this by pouring some resin into some orange peel, and it picked up the texture from the orange peel. So I use this quite a lot for bones. I found that a good way to smooth down detail in monster clay is to use a chip brush to brush it, and that has the effect of smoothing things down, but it also polishes it to a degree. You can actually get a bit of a shine on the monster clay if you do this for long enough. And I can use the soldering iron just to blend some of these shapes on the face. Now, because I want a bit of motion to this, I want to have some items which are sort of separate pieces. I'll mould and cast these separately, but that way they don't have to be attached to the main body entirely, and they can sort of flow a bit more freely. So I'm hoping this will give the sculpture a little bit more motion than it would otherwise have. So what I've done is to take some wire and put some epoxy on it, and I can then sculpt over these with hard monster clay in a similar way to the shoulder pads I did for the other sculpture. So as you can see, you can cut in some quite nice organic detail into these tentacles with the soldering iron. I figured I would also extend the idea of the skulls, and the idea being that perhaps this guy is using various bits of bone and things to make a costume. So I'm putting some skulls on the shoulders as well, as though they were shoulder pads, and he's also holding one on the base with his tentacles. I also need to texture up the back of the head as well. I've got all these sort of wrinkles which I've put in with the soldering iron, but I need some sort of skin texture as well. So what I've done is to take this small rock and just glue it to a paintbrush handle. Because it's got quite a lot of detail on it, it's quite good as a stamp. So what I can do is push this into the clay, smooth that out, and it gives me quite a cool sort of organic skin texture. So I'm just adding in some texture with that. And then I can smooth it down with some silicone sculpting tools, and I can also smooth it down further with a brush. Right, so there we go. So I've got quite obsessed with sculptures recently, and I'm getting towards the point now where I can mould these. So I think the next video will probably be a moulding video. I want to make some moulds of all of these, but that's where I am at the minute. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.